In this video, we're going to be discussing Rabbi Elozor of Worms, also known as the Rokeach, by the name of his book. Rabbi Elozor of Worms was born in the year 1160, and he passes away in the year 1238. He was born in the area of Mainz, and it seems that he, at some point, when he became a rabbi in the city of Worms, he is known as a great Kabbalist and halachist, a Tosafist, meaning a student of the rabbis of the Tosafos, and he is known by his magnum opus, was something he wrote at the end of his life. He wrote the Sefer Rokeach, which is a code of Jewish law that he wrote, and it's till this day it's a tremendous resource for studying Jewish law. This code, written in the 13th century. He was also a tremendous Kabbalist. He wrote on the Siddur. He was a poet. He wrote things that he wrote poetry that was inserted into the Siddur. However, most of his writings were lost. There are if you look in the introduction to the Sefer Rokeach, there are 55 works that are attributed to him. Most of them are not extant. However, we do know that he wrote many of these things. He was said to have had Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirit intervention, I guess you would call it. And he also dabbled in Kabbalah Maisis, which means he dabbled in practical Kabbalah at some point. Now, as far as his biography goes, probably the most tragic part of his life is that there was, during the Third Crusade, he was sitting in his home, and a mob entered his home and murdered his wife and 2 daughters in front of him, and other people. He himself was wounded, somehow survived, and this totally shaped his life. This tragedy. I don't think he had any other children later. I couldn't find any in my research. So obviously, this was a tragedy that changed his life. However, his students said that he dedicated himself to his students, and he was always a happy person, even though that this tremendous tragedy hung over his head. As far as his main book, his magnum opus, the Rokeach actually means the perfumer. Like we said, it's a code of Jewish law that he wrote at the end of his life. And the word Rokeach, Reish Kuf Ches, has the same value as Elazar, which was his name, so he kind of hinted to his name in this book. Some of his famous students were the Or Zarua, like we mentioned earlier in the previous video about Rabbi Huda Chassid, and as well as the Ramban. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides was one of his students, and received his Kabbalistic tradition from the Rabbi Elozor of Worms, from the Rokeach. He also was involved in making decrees, enactments, in the communities which he lived. Famously, he was involved with the Takanos Shum, which, as we talked about previously, Shum were these 3 cities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, on the Rhine River, in western Germany, I believe it is, near France. He teamed up with Rabbeinu Tam, the great Tosafist, who was his colleague, and they together made these Takanos Shum, which were enactments about what things that had to be done in the community. There are enactments, I just want to mention a couple that are followed till this day, that people might not know are attributed to him. For example, taking 3 steps backwards before one begins to pray. That was an enactment of the Rokeach of Rabbi Elozor of Worms. As well as when person every day, when they put on their talis, you're supposed to check your tzitzis. That is in order to make sure that one is making a blessing on a kosher talis. So the Rokeach made an enactment to say the verse Barchi Nafshi, which is a verse in Tehillim, and it has the same amount of words as the amount of strings and knots. So that way you could do it while it lines up the words with what you're doing, and apparently this was his enactment as well. This is something that is done until this day, that people might not know. These were some of his enactments. And again, he was also involved in these famous enactments in the community of Shul. His legacy is, again, while he did lead a tragic personal life, he is very well known as a Tosafist, as somebody in the era of the students of Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's descendants, and his other grandson, the Rashbam, was also one of his colleagues. So he was very much considered one of the great Tosafists, and again, he wrote a code of Jewish law of that era, which was kind of rare of that time and place. So it's a very important work, and as well, his Kabbalistic legacy. He perpetuated that legacy of Kabbalah through his students, including Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, one of his most important and famous students. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, comments, something I should have said, would have said, please leave a comment. We'd love to hear feedback.